Hello.
Our story continues as Imperial stormtroopers filled the streets of Sundari. In their command were a number of Imperial super commandos led by Gar Saxon. The Death Watch requested aid from the Empire, and in turn they would provide absolute loyalty to the Empire for freeing their planet from the ruthless Katan. The Empire couldn't help but take the offer. All they had to do was aid in the recapturing of Mandalore, and then Mandalore would be completely self-governed by a Mandalorian that was entirely loyal to the Empire. It was a win-win because they wouldn't have to station any Imperial troops on Mandalore. Katan was outraged. She tried to be diplomatic with the Empire for nearly a decade, and then this fool had to go ahead and align himself with the Empire. It was a ridiculous move by Gar Saxon, and Katan couldn't be more upset. The surprise attack was incredibly deadly for the people of Mandalore. They hardly could defend themselves from the onslaught. First, because it was a surprise attack, and second, because the Death Watch had the aid of the Galactic Empire, a regime built on militaristic oppression. Katan had to ensure the survival of her people, and a mass evacuation began, but it was already too late. Dozens were slaughtered in the streets. The Night Owls got all the Foundlings out of the city, either by picking them up and running with them, or pushing them into the Gauntlet-class transports. Luke and Leia looked back and watched as Sundari was torn apart, though the most heartbreaking thing was watching former Saxon loyalists rejoin his ranks. Their sight turned to Katan, and her people fighting back against the Empire. This was the first real showcase of death and destruction, aside from the battle in Concordia a little less than a year beforehand. Luke and Leia watched as people got shot in the streets, their fellow Mandalorians falling down, killed protecting the innocent, and then seeing the walkers land. The Mandalorians were out of their league, and they had to fight for their lives against an unstoppable force. The last thing Luke and Leia saw before they entered the Gauntlet was a building toppling over onto the Mandalorian positions where Katan was. The Foundlings were all concerned. The ship was rocked with blaster fire. TIE fighters were locking onto the gauntlets as they fired down, blasting away at the fleeing vessels. The gauntlets took any advantage they could muster as they whipped their ships away from Sundari. They had negotiated that they would go to Kalvala in case the Death Watcher Empire showed itself up on Sundari. Kalvala was the home of the powerful House Kryze. It was untouched by Death Watch and also by the Empire. It would be a safe haven for these Mandalorians. Instead of Sundari, there was fighting still going on in the streets. Gar Saxon led his men on a rampage on the beautiful city, killing all those who oppressed him. There were assaults on the buildings, killing off several innocent civilians, but when the battle was eventually won, the Empire would station a few groups of troops before departing. All their machines of war would be taken back, and Gar Saxon would be left to lead Mandalore on his own as an official governor on behalf of the Empire. The tragedy of all this was the fact that the Mandalorians were perfectly content with Imperial occupation. There was a reason behind it too. They believed that if the Empire was present, then they wouldn't have to worry about any more wars. The people had no clue that Katan had been resisting Imperial rule for nearly a decade, and now that that time was up, they were relieved to be under the control of an Imperial governor, who was also Mandalorian. It softened the blow for them, and they were all content with it, for the most part. Of course, there were those who couldn't be angrier, but they were silenced by Gar Saxon's oppressive rule. Saxon was brilliant. He knew he didn't have the numbers to withstand an all-out war with Katan, and so he went to the biggest power in the galaxy. It, of course, forced him to be loyal to the Empire, but he was fine with it because, in the end, he was the de facto leader of the Mandalorians. All we had to do was simply not piss off the Emperor, which realistically, aside from Palpatine's temper, wasn't exactly too hard to worry about. Gar Saxon and Mandalore were far enough away from the core where it didn't really matter what they did, as long as they didn't defy the reign of the Empire or the Emperor himself. On Kalvala, the Mandalorians were outraged. How could Gar use the Empire against them? In reality, it was essentially the same thing Katan had done years before with the Republic's siege of Mandalore, so in a way it was revenge, but it was still ludicrous. The Empire took advantage of Bo not wanting to serve with them. Bo would be the final one to return to her home world. She had survived, barely, after dragging out a couple of her friends before they escaped the onslaught of the Empire. Luke and Leia saw the dramatic and even traumatic effect that Gar Saxon and the Death Watch had on the people of Mandalore, and they immediately became obsessed with destroying him. They were motivated, and the days couldn't come fast enough for them to eventually become adults so that they could go make sure that Gar Saxon suffered. Of course, they had a lot of growing to do, and it would take its time. Bo in this time would help her people, trying to keep them inspired, but only so few were. She could tell there was genuine resentment for her, and even in her failure, she couldn't have done anything to stop the Empire. Maybe there were mistakes in her past that would have stopped this from ever happening, but she couldn't afford to live in the past. Her people's numbers were down. When she used to have more fighters in the Death Watch, she no longer had the forces to fight against the Death Watch on a skirmish. She would have to progressively play the long game, wait until the Foundlings were ready to strike, and then when the Death Watch wasn't ready, take every little piece as they could away from their enemies. It would be difficult, and it would require strategy, but it would be worth their time, because they would not be destroyed by the Empire and definitely not by Clan Saxon. For 5 years, the Mandalorians would work hard on Kalvala. There would be multiple circumstances of getting into combat with the Death Watch, but not just the Death Watch, but the Empire too. The Empire had multiple shipments that they would send to the now Imperial-controlled Mandalore, and those shipments carried supplies for war, civilians, and just about anything Governor Saxon requested. He had earned favorability with the Empire, and even one of his lovely subjects had created an incredible weapon for the Empire called the Arc Pulse Generator. The weapon itself was designed by a Mandalorian named Sabine Wren, who worked for the Empire, and it was eventually destroyed by her after believing it was negative. It was. The Arc Pulse Generator could destroy and cut through Mandalorian Beskar armor. While she may have sabotaged her own piece of work, the Empire would eventually figure out how to reconstruct the weapon of mass destruction. On Kalvala, Luke and Leia were 15. They were at essentially their adult height, which they really weren't going to grow much more than they already did. As teenagers, they went from the lower class of Foundlings to the best of them. They were the best warriors around. Of course, it cost them so much time and effort to get this good. They sacrificed free time, bruises, getting the wind knocked out of them, broken bones, and so forth. But they were the best of the Foundlings. Their struggles were what made them strong. Together, they were incredible, just as they were when they were kids. But as individuals, they were respectively both too much to handle. Of course, for each other, they were essentially even. Only they could beat each other. But they were so close that it really didn't matter the victory because of what they put each other through. At this point in their lives, they both displayed a little bit of ability to use the Force, but they didn't really know what it was. The only one who did and never picked up on it, which left her stumped, was Bo-Katan. Luke and Leia were the most promising warriors for her future of Mandalore, and she didn't want to give them up. She didn't know if she could call her good friend Ahsoka Tano and see if she wanted the possible Jedi recruits, or if she wanted to keep them a secret from the galaxy. Of course, she could let the two of them decide, but she didn't know how to feel about possibly losing Luke and Leia. They were tiers above anybody in their own weight class, which actually went for some adults too. It was unfair fighting with either of the twins. Luke and Leia were such powerhouse fighters, it wasn't even a competition for the two of them, especially because without their knowledge, they were using the Force to abuse their competitors. Of course, you were guaranteed to win if you could see someone else's move before they even made it. It was an unfair advantage, but they weren't even using the most of their abilities. Bo-Katan reluctantly did what she thought would be best for Luke and Leia, and so she called upon her friend Ahsoka Tano, who would arrive mere days after. Ahsoka, when she arrived, took Luke and Leia aside. She had no clue that she was talking to Anakin's children, let alone the fact that Anakin, now Vader, had survived. Ahsoka asked the Skywalker twins if they noticed any special abilities about them, to which they truthfully hadn't. Ahsoka was able to take a midichlorian test of the two of them and was astonished to see how far along the two of them had gone without noticing. Both of them were off the charts. There were very few Jedi aside from Anakin and Yoda that had a higher midichlorian count than the two of them. Ahsoka told the twins that she was a Force user herself, and she could educate the two of them in the ways of the Force. Luke looked at his sister and she shook her head disapprovingly, and Luke agreed. They both told Ahsoka that while her offer was nice, they were Mandalorians, and their duty was to Mandalore in taking it back from Gar Saxon. They had no interest in learning from some whimsical power in the galaxy or whatnot. The two of them were familiar with the Jedi, but they didn't realize that Ahsoka, as a Force user, and the Jedi were connected. Bo-Katan was genuinely surprised that the twins didn't take the option, but she was deeply relieved. A couple weeks later, there would be a ceremony held for the most elite of the Foundling, and where they would go based on their skills and talents. There were a couple of kids around the same age as Luke and Leia that were called first. One of them was a pilot, the other one was to become a dedicated armorer, and the couple others were simply just to become grunts. To Luke and Leia, they thought that they would get a bad job to follow up with, but that was far from the truth. Bo-Katan herself wanted to choose them last because they would become the first Foundlings in 3 years that were talented enough and skilled enough to join her and her elite squad called the Night Owls. Bo-Katan knew that Luke and Leia were ready for this task, and she was really happy to welcome the two of them into her ranks. Bo-Katan would take her new squad of Night Owls to an icy planet not far from Mandalore called Crownest. where Clan Ren held their home. Bo-Katan had some disputes with Clan Ren before, but she was looking to gain new allies here on this mission, so that's where she went. Luke and Leia were excited about the armorer outfitting their outfits with the crest of the Night Owl. When the Mandalorians arrived at the home of Clan Ren, they were met with genuine hostility. Clan Ren wasn't exactly fond of having Mandalorian visitors, because the last time a Mandalorian paid them a visit, they were almost included in the little Mandalorian civil war that had been raging on for several years. Clan Ren, truthfully, had absolutely no interest in joining Bo-Katan and her technical rebels. She believed that the Empire was too much of an overbearing foe for them to handle. Bo was very easily disappointed, but she was prepared for Clan Ren to deny helping them, so how disappointed could she really be? At the same time, one of her close followers informed her that the Empire had arrived in the Mandalore system. Bo looked at her crew and nodded her head as they booked it back to the gauntlet. The ship lifted off and shot into the sky. It was an Imperial Star Destroyer. The reason it was here was unknown, but if the Empire was going to just place itself here, then that could only mean that Imperial occupation was only getting worse. Bo had to make a judgment call. Running an attack on the Empire was a terrible idea. It could cause significant struggle for the Mandalorians as a whole if they tried to beat it, but leaving it allowed Gar Saxon to control Mandalore through an iron fist that did not belong to him or Mandalore. Bo knew that while she and her squad could force their way onto the destroyer, there was no guaranteeing that it would work or be successful as an endeavor for the group of them. So, instead they returned to Kalvala. Luke and Leia, on the other hand, were rambunctious teenagers. They asked Bo why they didn't go after the destroyer. Bo explained that the Empire was oppressive. If they provoked them, then they would have every reason to attack them and destroy them. If they provoked the Empire, then they could lose everything worth fighting for. Luke and Leia may have known the Mandalorian way in and out, but they still had much to learn about leadership, and who better to learn from than Bo-Katan? She was experienced in victories and the defeats of being a leader. Bo learned a lot from each experience, and because she knew she had Luke and Leia's loyalty, she would do everything in her power to pass on her teachings to them. Bo wanted the two of these to be her long-standing allies, so they would be around her 24/7, and train with her specifically. The two of them were the best warriors of the Foundlings, but they had so much more learning to do. So Bo wanted to have them spend time and train exclusively with her cohorts in the Night Owls. They were the Night Owls anyways, so it only made sense to train with them. Leia was incredibly skilled with her blaster, however, her brother specialized in hand-to-hand combat. There were several attributes that both siblings had that made them incredible as a duo, though as individuals it made them weak. Bo-Katan agreed that they needed to be together on missions, but they also needed to be strong individuals. It's something that had haunted them throughout their journey as Mandalorians, the fact that they could only be successful together. Yeah, they were the best of the Foundlings, but that changed in the scope of adulthood. They needed not just strength, but they also needed strategy, strength, power, and knowledge. If they didn't have any of those, then they would fail to stand up to the regular warriors of the Mandalorians, let alone the elite Mandalorians like the Night Owls of which they faced. Luke was tested on his own. He was forced to challenge himself in blaster training, whereas his sister was forced to learn more aggressive forms of physical combat. This would translate well for the twins. For the next couple years, the twins would get increasingly better at what they were weak at, which for them made them each take an ego shot. They needed to reduce their egos because when they were Foundlings, at least at the end of being Foundlings, they were the best of the best. They had to become the worst so that they could eventually become the best, which for them right now, they kinda were. It was mostly thanks to the hard work they put into their training, but the Force did help them as well. Over the past few years, the Empire had expanded out. Because the rebellion didn't have the same aid of Senator Bail Organa, the rebels were struggling. Bail Organa and his would-be-have-been daughter, Leia Organa, would have been incredibly necessary for the help of the rebellion. The rebels had acquired a victory at Aldhani and one at Ferrix, kinda, but overall the rebel cells were struggling to unite. Mon Mothma was doing her best, but the rebels at Lothal were struggling, not to mention that there was someone by the name of Saw Gerrera out in the galaxy causing terror. General Dodonna and Captain Soto hadn't yet been put into communication with each other, and former Jedi Ahsoka Tano knew that there was help available on Kalvala, and the rebellion needed it. Kanan and Ezra needed it as well. She abandoned the rebel cell to come to Kalvala in another attempt to get Luke and Leia to join them. Last time it wasn't necessary. This time it was very necessary, and the rebels needed help. And while Ahsoka didn't know they were Anakin's children, she did know that they were very powerful. When Ahsoka returned to Kalvala, she tried to plead with the now 17-year-old Mandalorian warriors, but nothing she could say would convince them to join the ranks of the rebellion. They were fighting the Empire for their home, not for the rebels or anyone else. Mandalore was all they cared about, and it's what they needed. Ahsoka was obviously disappointed, but she needed to make the best of the situation. If she she didn't, then the rebellion would likely fail. Ahsoka left Kalvala once more without the new Force users. The fight for the rebellion would be futile. Ahsoka, not long after Kalvala, would fall victim to Darth Vader on Malachor. Of course, she would be saved by Ezra Bridger via the World Between Worlds, but shortly after the rebel victory on Lothal, the rebellion would be crushed. The rebels would steal the plans to Project Stardust and achieve a slight victory at Scarif before Darth Vader arrived, destroying most of the rebel fleet. The rebel plans would escape from the Battle of Scarif, and the Empire would track the plans all the way back to Yavin. With the knowledge of the rebel base, the Empire, fresh after using the Death Star at Scarif and Jedha City, would obliterate the planet of Yavin 4, killing the rest of the rebels, while the few individuals who fought in the space battle were cut apart by a pilot of the Force named Vader. The rebels were almost entirely eliminated from the galaxy, though there was some positivity in that same period of time. Gar Saxon was killed by Ursa Wren, and with the Imperial regime focused on the destruction of the rebellion, Bo-Katan and her Mandalorians prepared for an invasion of Mandalore. On top of that, Bo-Katan was given the Darksaber. There was one issue. There was still a destroyer orbiting the planet of Mandalore, so Bo-Katan tasked Luke and Leia with dropping into the destroyer and disabling the vessel. They were the only duo that was capable of pulling off this mission together. She knew that she could throw more individuals at the destroyer, but she needed every body she could for this mission. If she didn't utilize her forces to the maximum potential, this attack on Mandalore could become a failure. When the gauntlet sped past the destroyer, a pod was ejected and smacked into the side of the Star Destroyer. The gauntlets didn't engage the Star Destroyers because the vessels were much too large, and the Star Destroyer cannons would have had no issue picking off the gauntlets. As the gauntlets descended to the surface of Mandalore, Luke and Leia escaped the pod and ran down the hallways. Alarms began to ring. The vessel made sure that everyone was aware that someone had breached the destroyer. The last time Luke or Leia saw a stormtrooper, they were escaping Sundari during the Imperial siege of Mandalore. They ducked in and out of corridors, dodging stormtroopers. They were looking for the reactor room. Bo-Katan had shown the two of them maps of old Venator-class Star Destroyers, hoping it would help, and truthfully, it did. Many of the Imperial Star Destroyer interior designs were based off the Venator design and layout, just much larger. And it was basically the same thing as a Venator. Though the Imperial Star Destroyer was incredibly large, so the Mandalorians ran through the halls of the Star Destroyer. They used their tricks to cut down stormtroopers that got in their way. It was very efficient, especially torching them in a hallway with no escape. Luke and Leia were Mandalorian by definition, and the grunts of the Imperial army stood no chance against these Mandalorian children. Luke and Leia didn't split up, and when they came around the corner to a dozen stormtroopers, they realized they were outnumbered. But with Mandalorians, it was never about numbers. Leia shoved her brother in a playful way as she launched her entire wrist full of whistling birds as she joyously watched them cut through the Imperial troops. Luke shoved his sister back. He was so upset that he couldn't do it. Leia told him he had to be faster next time. As the two of them opened up the room to the reactor room, Luke shoved his sister into the door hinge as he ignited his jetpack, flying over the deckhands inside the reactor room. They all panicked as Luke pulled out his two pistols and fired away, killing each of the Imperial deckhands before he lowered himself to the ground, taking his helmet off. He gave his sister a sly look that screamed, "Ha! Look at me!" Leia told Luke that he was a show-off as he started meddling with the control panels. Leia told Luke that he was being ridiculous. He looked at her and she tapped him on the head, telling him to use his brain. Before she lowered her back and shot a rocket into the reactor. Luke smiled before putting his helmet back on and shooting a missile onto the other reactor. Luke and Leia ran towards the exit. Leia asked where the hangar bay was. Luke pointed down a hallway, telling her that he thought it was down there. The two of them kept running. Every so often, they shot an Imperial stormtrooper officer dead. Though truthfully, they weren't on the radar for most of the stormtroopers or Imperial officers. The reason being is that there was an evacuation code being given out. The reactor destruction was causing the ship to self-destruct. The two Mandalorians got into the hangar bay and found some TIE fighters. They used their jetpacks to get up to the TIE fighters before lifting off and shooting out of the vessel. The Star Destroyer began firing its heavy turbo lasers at the TIE fighters, but the twins were great pilots, and they escaped the range of the turbo lasers before everything exploded on the destroyer. The twins piloted down through the clouds as they came out over Sundari and saw a massive battle taking place. Gauntlets in the air, dogfighting. The twins avoided fire from the Death Watch as they cut down the very few Mandalorians firing at their vessel. The TIE fighters got to Sundari at the landing docks, and Luke and Leia leapt from their ships and joined the combat. They didn't know where Bo-Katan was, but they did know that she was making a push for the throne room. In the streets, people were running away. Luke stopped seeing the same thing he saw many years before. However, there was a distinct difference. The Night Owls and Bo-Katan's Mandalorians weren't terrorizing the population, they were liberating. Inside the throne room, Bo-Katan took complete control. It was an absolute victory. The Mandalorians took back their home. The few remaining Death Watch members didn't get a chance to retreat. Instead, they jumped into the sewers in hopes of hiding until they could escape, which would work for them in time being. Luke and Leia were welcomed into the throne room to be with Bo-Katan and the rest of the Night Owls. They'd be celebrating the victory at the end of the night, in front of the entire population. Bo was so proud of her people for standing up to the Empire, and she was incredibly proud of Luke and Leia. They contributed to this larger than most. Taking out the Star Destroyer allowed the Mandalorians to have essentially free, untouched access to the attack on Sundari. There would have to be some eventual fixing, especially since the ruler under Imperial authority was, well, restrictive to say the least. Bo would liberate the people fully, and with the aid of the Darksaber under her control, she would try and unite the Mandalorians. After celebration that night, Bo would return to Concordia, and then to Crownest with Luke by her side. She and Luke were going as a pair to inform the other Mandalorians that Bo was the rightful ruler of Mandalore, and while she hadn't been the one who won the Darksaber, it was in her control, and there was no one who could dispute it. It was just a matter of who would join Bo-Katan and who wouldn't. Certainly some of them would, but others would try and challenge her for the Darksaber. While this was happening, Leia was on Mandalore with the rest of the Night Owls preparing to rebuild Sundari, and then one of the Regs ran in telling them that they were in trouble. They sent out a distress signal, but it was far too late. Blowing up an Imperial Star Destroyer didn't please the Empire, and so Moff Gideon, whose fleet was in the sector, was deployed to reduce Mandalore to ash. Not to mention that the Arc Pulse Generator had been rebuilt since Sabine destroyed it. The Mandalorians rushed to their fighters and prepared to fight back, but when two Imperial Star Destroyers released all their TIE fighters, it was clear that they were outmatched. The TIE bombers, on the other hand, started a bombing run on the capital city of Sundari. Gideon ordered probe droids and Kayax enforcer droids to the surface to kill any of the survivors. It didn't take long for the Mandalorian capital to explode, killing every civilian on the inside, including Leia. On the other hand, Bo-Katan and Luke came out of hyperspace in their gauntlet after getting the distress signal from Mandalore. When they saw the Imperial fleet, they were terrified of what could have been done to the capital Sundari. Before they could fly down, they were locked onto by Gideon's personal Star Destroyer. The tractor beam hit them. The gauntlet was dragged into the Star Destroyer, and when Bo and Luke made their escape, they were captured. Gideon came down to the hangar bay to see the Mandalorians, essentially the last of their kind. Gideon got to joyously watch the Mandalorians on the surface be executed, at the very least, the few who survived. When he saw Bo-Katan, he couldn't help himself. He loved collecting relics, and something that would look great in his arsenal was the legendary Darksaber, and so he challenged Bo-Katan to a fight for the Darksaber. She didn't accept it because he wasn't Mandalorian, so he executed her. Luke cried out angrily. Gideon told Luke that if he wanted to challenge him for the Darksaber, then he would have to fight him to take the Darksaber from him. Luke stood up and used his grapple to get the Darksaber into his hands as he ignited it. And Gideon smiled as he stepped back, pulling out another relic. And he had gotten it after one of Vader's final kills. The lightsaber belonged to former Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi. Vader thought he lost it because he killed Kenobi during an invasion, but it was Gideon who stole it. Gideon was going to take the Darksaber and collect it for his personal collection. The two of them slammed their blades against each other. Luke swung with the Darksaber as he tried to cut through Gideon, but there was an issue. Every single strike Luke took got heavier than the last. Luke hadn't ever handled the Darksaber, and because he didn't know that to wield a lightsaber took energetic balance, he didn't know what he was doing. Luke was unable to figure that out, so he tossed the Darksaber to his side and shot into the air using his jetpack, and then began shooting at Gideon, clipping them off in the shoulder. Gideon fell backwards and looked down at the ground, holding his shoulder, while secretly grabbing his pistol. Luke lugged the Darksaber into his hand so that he could execute Gideon. The Moff smiled as Luke crept up on him. As Luke stood over him, he dragged the Darksaber above his head in an attempt to execute Gideon, and then the Imperial Moff turned around and blasted Luke in the helmet, knocking the helmet off of his head and throwing him to the ground. Luke was so shocked, he didn't know what to do. Gideon did. He got up, kicking Luke's blaster from his other hand, and then stepping on it with his boot. Gideon told Luke that the Darksaber required alignment with the blade. Shamefully, a lesson his friend could never be taught. Luke cried out as Gideon plunged the Darksaber into him. Afterwards, he told the Imperial troops to get rid of the trash and prepare to move to Kalvala, Crownest, and Concordia. They were going under mandate by the Emperor himself to kill the rest of the Mandalorians. Their race would be completely wiped off the face of the galaxy. All Mandalorians would be killed. Gideon didn't take time on his ceremony. He traveled to each planet, wiping out their entire global population before heading to the next planet. With the Mandalorians, the Jedi, and the Rebellion all but extinct, the evil Emperor of the Galaxy would ensure his longevity by removing his apprentice, setting a trap for him and having him killed. For having done his duty, of course. Just like Dooku before him, and before Dooku, Maul. It was all in service to Palpatine and the greater plan. Plus, he had a new apprentice, one far more powerful. And if that didn't work, his new cloning program would obviously clean up that issue. The galaxy forever would be ruled by the Empire, and under the control of the Dark Lord of the Sith. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of our story. Again, special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Tiger Boy, Darth Revan, Pimp Daddy Bane, Darth Cheesy, Apollo, Mad Medic Studios, Anakin003, Lemon Knight, Flynn Vencees, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. Hit 2,000 likes on this video. I don't know what's coming next, but it is. Let's talk about our story. So, you didn't expect that coming, did you? I thought this story didn't really have a happy ending, and the reason it is because there's a reason canon exists, and I think that's the main point of this, is that there's a reason why Luke and Leia are where they are, because if they're not there, then I think if they're not like actively participating in rebellion, then rebellion fails. And that's not just because of Luke's super awesome, really lucky shot. That's also because of the importance of the Organas, for example. You know, Bail Organa had a really important part of the early rebellion, and I wanted that to be felt evident. Of course, Mon Mothma is like the leader of the rebellion, and she's integral to it, but Bail Organa also, you know, brought certain members together. He had, you know, and Rebels, he had Leia go to Lothal and help out on certain missions. And so Bail Organa had a very important part in the rebellion, much like Mon Mothma. And so I wanted to at least make it seem like there was, without Bail Organa, a little bit more struggle for the rebellion to endure. And, you know, do I think the rebellion has a chance? Certainly, but, you know, without Luke and Leia, I don't see them defeating the Death Star at the very least. Let alone fighting off the rest of the Empire. And obviously in a battle like Scarif, where they lose their entire fleet, and they don't have a magic guy who can destroy the Death Star, that's not going to work too well, I don't think. You know, you can know the plans, but as we saw in A New Hope, not everyone knows how to fire their torpedoes, you know? So that's kind of the main thing there. As for the Mandalorian story, I really had a lot of fun with this. Main reason being is, like, having Luke and Leia in this story as Mandalorian Foundlings was really cool, because I got to keep them as like Force users, but not over rely on the Force. And that's something I really try to stay away from and stray away from in these stories, is over reliance on the Force. Because, like, if I'm writing a story about a Mandalorian, I feel like it needs to be about a Mandalorian. Yes, I know the guy that made the Darksaber was Mandalorian and a Jedi. I know. I don't really care. These are trying to be unique stories. I'm not trying to do something that you've already seen before, obviously. As we've seen with Anakin being a Mandalorian and with Obi-Wan being a Mandalorian, it's not the same story as, hey, I'm a Mandalorian Jedi. You know, that story has been done before, and I'm always trying to do something unique and trying to do something that's not, again, been seen. And so, sticking away from that, obviously there's always a way that I could do a different interpretation of that, but I always with these last couple of videos based on known Force users being Mandalorian, I wanted to focus on the effect of them just being Mandalorian without them being persuaded or dissuaded by the Force in any way, shape, or form. And I think the same goes for here. Luke was 19 and he hadn't ever realized he was Force sensitive, essentially, and same goes for Leia until, like, I think Empires, when she first realized. I could be completely wrong, I could be messing that up or getting mixed up with something, but like they didn't realize they were Force sensitive until they were adults. And so, like, Luke and Leia not really knowing that they were using abilities or anything like that could just be them being like, oh, you know, whatever, it's not that big of a deal. And then someone comes and says that to them, they're like, yeah, I don't really believe that much, you know, I don't believe that, so no. Like, that's kind of what I wanted to set up here. And also, I thought it'd be kind of cool to bring in Ahsoka and make you feel like I was going to have them go to Jedi route and be like, oh, they're going to become Jedi, and they'd be like, no, actually the rebellion's going to destroy. So I wanted to throw some twists and turns in there. Obviously this isn't the happy ending, but as I said, I don't really see there being a feasible way for there to be a happy ending without Luke and Leia contributing heavily to the rebellion. I'm not saying they're the only reason the rebellion won, but I think the first Death Star being destroyed really kind of helped morale for the rebellion. If you've seen Rogue One, you know what I'm talking about. Like the whole rebellion, like, yeah, we're not going to do this anymore. So I feel like without that, you know, whole thing getting destroyed, then yeah. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.